Section 2, War Affects Society. The Civil War caused social, economic, and political changes in the North and the South. One American Story. As the Civil War moved into its third year, the constant demand for men and resources began to take its toll back home. Sometimes the hardship endured by civilians resulted in angry scenes like that witnessed by Agnes, a resident of Richmond, Virginia. On April 13, 1863, Agnes went for her morning walk and soon came upon a group of hungry women and children who had gathered in front of the Capitol. She described the scene as these women and children were joined by other people who were upset by the food shortage. The crowd now rapidly increased and numbered, I am sure, more than 1,000 women and children. It grew and grew until it reached the dignity of a mob, a bread riot. The mob went out of control. It broke into shops and stole food, clothing, and other goods. Only the arrival of Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the threat of force ended the riot. In this section, you will read more about the hardships that the Civil War caused on the home front. These hardships caused changes in civilian society in both the North and the South. Disagreement about the war. In the spring of 1863, riots like the one in Richmond broke out in a number of Southern towns. Southerners were growing weary of the war and the constant sacrifices it demanded. Confederate soldiers began to leave the army in increasing numbers. By the end of the year, the Confederate Army had lost nearly 40% of its men. Some of these men were on leave, but many others were deserters. Faced with the difficulties of waging war, the Confederate States fell into disagreement. The same principle of states' rights that had led them to break with the Union kept them from coordinating their war effort. As one Southern governor put it, I am still a rebel, no matter what or who may be in power. Disagreements over the conduct of the war also arose in the North. Lincoln's main opponents were the Copperheads, Northern Democrats who favored peace with the South. A Copperhead is a poisonous snake that strikes without warning. Lincoln had protesters arrested. He also suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which prevents the government from holding a citizen without trial. Draft laws. As the war dragged on, both the North and the South needed more soldiers. As a result, both sides passed laws of conscription, also known as the draft. These laws required men to serve in the military. The Confederates had been drafting soldiers since the spring of 1862. By 1863, all able-bodied white men between the age of 18 and 45 were required to join the Army. However, there were a number of exceptions. Planters who owned 20 or more slaves could avoid military service. In addition, wealthy men could hire substitutes to serve in their place. By 1863, substitutes might cost as much as $6,000. The fact that wealthy men could avoid service caused poor Southerners to complain that it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. The Union draft law was passed in March 1863. Like the Confederacy, the Union allowed draftees to hire substitutes. However, the North also offered $300 bounties, or cash payments, to men who volunteered to serve. As a result, only a small percentage of men in the North were drafted. Most men volunteered and received the bounty. Even so, the draft was extremely unpopular. In July of 1863, anger over the draft and simmering racial tensions led the New York City draft riots. For 4 days, rioters destroyed property and attacked people on the streets. Over 100 people were killed, many of them African Americans. Economic effects of the war. Many people suffered economic hardships during the war. The suffering was severe in the South, where most battles were fought, but the North also experienced difficulties. Food shortages were very common in the South, partly because some farmers were fighting in the Confederate Army. Moreover, food sometimes could not get to the market because trains were being used to carry war materials. The Confederate Army also seized food and other supplies for its own need. Another problem, especially in the South, was inflation, an increase in the price and the decrease of the value of money. The average family food bill in the South increased from $6.65 a month in 1861 to $68 by mid-1863. Over the course of the war, prices rose 9,000% in the South. Inflation in the North was much lower, but prices still rose faster than wages, making life harder for working people. Some people took advantage of wartime demand and sold goods for high prices. Overall, though, the war production boosted Northern industry and fueled the economy. In the short term, this gave the North an economic advantage over the South. In the long term, industry would begin to replace farming as a basis for the national economy. During the war, the federal government passed two important economic measures. In 1861, it established the first income tax, a tax on earning. The following year, the government issued a new paper currency known as greenbacks because of their color. The new currency helped the northern economy by ensuring that people had money to spend. It also helped the Union pay for the war. Some Southerners in the border states took advantage of the stronger Union economy by selling cotton to Northern traders in violation of Confederate law. Yankee gold, wrote one Confederate officer, is fast accomplishing what the Yankee arms could never achieve, the subjugation of our people. Resistance by slaves. Another factor that affected the South was the growing resistance from slaves. To hurt the Southern economy, slaves slowed their pace of work or stopped working altogether. Some carried out sabotage, destroying crops and farm equipment to hurt the plantation economy. When white planters fled advancing Union armies, slaves often refused to go along. They stayed behind waiting for Union soldiers to free them. Some enslaved people even rose up in rebellion against their overseers. More commonly, though, slaves ran away from their plantations to join the Union forces as they pushed farther into Confederate territory. One Union officer described a common sight. It was very touching to see the vast numbers of colored women following after us with babies in their arms, and little ones like our Anna clinging to their tattered skirts. One poor creature, while nobody was looking, hid two boys, 5 years old, in a wagon, intending, I suppose, that they should see the land of freedom if she couldn't. After Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the number of slaves fleeing Southern plantations greatly increased. By the end of the war, as many as 500,000 had fled to Union lines. Women aid the war effort. With so many men away at war, women in both the North and the South assumed increased responsibility. Women plowed fields and ran farms and plantations. They also took over jobs in offices and factories that had previously been done only by men. Other social changes came about because of the thousands of women who served in the front lines as volunteer workers and nurses. Susie King Taylor was an African-American woman who wrote an account of her experiences as a volunteer with African-American regiments. She asked her readers to remember that many lives were lost, not men alone, but noble women as well. Relief agencies put women to work washing clothes, gathering supplies, and cooking food for soldiers. Also, nursing became a respectable profession for many women. By the end of the war, around 3,000 nurses has worked under the leadership of Dorothea Dix in the Union hospitals. Southern women were also active as nurses and volunteers on the front. Women also played a key role as spies in both the North and the South. Harriet Tubman served as a spy for Union forces along the coast of South Carolina. The most famous Confederate spy was Belly Boyd. Although she was arrested 6 times, she continued her work through much of the war. At one point, she even sent messages from her jail cell by putting them in rubber balls and tossing them out the window. Civil War prison camps. Women caught spying were thrown into jail, but soldiers captured in battle suffered far more. At prison camps in both the North and the South, prisoners of war faced terrible conditions. One of the worst prison camps in the North was Elmira, New York. Perhaps the harshest feature of prison life at the camp was the New York winter. One prisoner called the Elmira an excellent summer prison for Southern soldiers, but an excellent place for them to find their graves in the winter.
School teachers, attention please. Starting a breakfast program today. The crates should be delivered to your homeroom. What you guys will need to do, put a check mark next to the student's name only that takes breakfast. So if they are here and opt out of it, don't put a check mark next to their name. Then have one of the kids bring the crate back to the double doors that go into the kitchen outside my office. If you got any questions, just give me a call. You guys should be done with the breakfast at about 5 after 8. If it takes a little bit longer today, that's fine. Again, just give me a call if you got any issues.
One prisoner called Elmira, where did I leave off? In just 1 year, more than 24% of Elmira's 12,122 prisoners died of sickness and exposure to severe weather. Conditions were also horrible in the South. The camp with the worst reputation was Andersonville, Georgia. Built to hold 10,000 prisoners, at one point it housed 33,000. Inmates had little shelter from the heat or cold. Most slept in holes scratched in the dirt. Drinking water came from one tiny creek that also served as a sewer. As many as 100 men per day died at Andersonville from starvation, disease, and exposure. People who saw the camps were shocked by the conditions of the soldiers. The poet Walt Whitman, who also served as a Union nurse, described a group of soldiers who returned from a prison camp. He exclaimed, "Can those be men? Are they not really mummied, dwindled corpses?" Around 50,000 men died in Civil War prison camps. But this number was dwarfed by the number of dead on battlefronts and even more from disease in army camps. In the next section, you will read about the bloody battles that led to the end of the Civil War.